What a great day. So inspirational. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Nicole Flora. I'm the Executive Director of the Lake County Economic Development Corporation. I am lucky enough to be born and raised in Eureka, started my economic development career with the County of Humboldt, and I'm now blessed to be a resident in Lake County. I was asked earlier this week to introduce this next panel of experts, and I almost said no, and then I decided this is going to be a room of friendly faces, so I'm fighting back my fear and doing it anyway. So up next, we have a very impressive lineup of experts that will talk about climate and disaster resilience and how they're intertwined. This 2-page listing of their expertise is filled with acronyms that I will attempt to describe to you, so bear with me and wish me luck. Okay, Dr. Eric Riggs is the facilitator of this panel. Prior to accepting the position of the Dean of Humboldt's College of Natural Resources and Sciences, Dr. Eric Riggs served as the Professor of Geoscience Education in the Department of Geology and Geophysics at Texas A&M University. Dr. Riggs served as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Climate in the College of Geosciences from 2011 until 2018, where he was charged with monitoring the academic climate and diversity of the college and was tasked with taking direct action to improve the environment for an increasingly diverse population of facility, students, and staff. So far, so good. Mike Cottone, did I get that right, Mike? I haven't met you yet. Is the Deputy Director of the Trinity County Health and Human Services and Office of Emergency Services. He spent over 32 years in government service, 8 in the U.S. Navy and 24 in the county government. Mike earned a master's degree in and teaches courses in human services. Mike is a board-certified practitioner, a member of California Association of Public Administrators, Public Guardians, and Public Conservators, and a member of the Area Agency on Aging Advisory Council. Welcome, Mike, and thank you for your service. I'm not sure where you are. I told you, it's impressive. Clarke Stevenson is the Forest Biomass and Fire Resilience Specialist at the Watershed Research and Training Center. Clarke works across a variety of watershed centers' local, regional, and statewide programs, where much of his work focuses on increasing forest biomass utilization in the North Coast. Clarke is the point of contact for the North Coast Resource Partnership's Woody Feedstock Aggregation Pilot Project funded by the Office of Planning and Research, and is excited to be working with cross-sector hubs on providing economic opportunities from fuel reduction efforts. Before the WRTC, Clarke, I swear, I knew this was going to be a struggle. Clarke worked for an air district and bioenergy attorney supporting estate policy and program development to overcome barriers to wood utilization, developing new biomass pathways, and promoting rural economies. He holds an MS in energy technology and policy from Cal Poly Humboldt and is based out of Arcata. Nick Bowen Crawford was born and raised in Humboldt County and recently returned to the Redwood Coast. He serves as the executive director of Humboldt Made, a nonprofit that serves to positively impact local economic development. Nick found himself in leadership positions during the pandemic in Atlanta, Georgia, and has brought his experience to Humboldt County, where he was active in feeding people in the aftermath of the 2022 earthquake and storms. He holds a leadership position in the newly formed Community Organizing Active in Disaster Group and is the chair of Humboldt County's first formal long-term recovery group. Okay, guys, come on up. Don't let me up here alone. We got 2 more to go. Terre Logsdon. Terry's always an advocate for the environment and community. Terry serves as the Chief Climate Resiliency Officer and Tribal Liaison for the County of Lake. After previously serving as the Tribal Environmental Director for the Scotts Valley Band of Indians and the Chief Operation Officer for the Clean Carbon Corporation, a tribally owned business that is part of the Scotts Valley Energy Company based in Lakeport, with an MA in Managerial Leadership and a BA in Liberal Arts with a specialization in Science and Values and an Agroecology Design Certificate. In the past, she also served as the Farm to School Coordinator for Lake County and was the co-founder of a local wireless internet service provider. She's an avid kayaking, hiking, and nature photography enthusiast. She's proud to live along the shores of Clear Lake and call Lake County home. And last but not least, we have Reverend Shannon Kimball-Oth. She is part of the new Community Adaptation Program with the American Red Cross, transforming how communities cope with disaster. Previously, she served as the Manager of Community Integration for Adventist Health and led Project Restoration, a residential program for patients with complex medical issues exasperated by the experience of housing displacement. This collaborative work influenced the development of the Hope Center, a transitional living facility which she managed for Hope Rising. She has served as a pastor for 30 years and has helped open the first warming center in Lake County by uniting churches, nonprofits, and volunteers. This work proved to be a good foundation for multi-sector collaborations, including serving as the Lake County Disaster Coordinator with the United Methodist Committee on Relief, and the transformation of Team Lake County, a long-term recovery group after Lake County's series of devastating wildfires. And there you have it.
So following that very tough introduction and the really tough act of Senator McGuire and my colleagues, Drs. Pastor and Benner, I can be the self-deprecating academic all day long, but from that perspective, as dean of a college, I get the chance to basically take really intelligent people and help them look more intelligent and give them great resources. And so we're doing this again today. I'm here for color and flavor. I'm a geoscientist, and so I'm used to thinking about disasters and climate change at a global level, right? But these are folks, and all the places I've worked in my career, it's folks at the local level who have to deal with the intersection of all this in real time, outside of politics, outside of global perspective often, but with real problems to solve for real people, for communities that we all live in. So this team is fantastic, and so I have a variety of questions for them. I'm going to lead them through. What I would like them to do is to, on top of that phenomenal introduction, thank you for trying to power through all those bios, that was a lot, I'd like them to introduce themselves in their own words and how they see the challenges that they face and things like that, how they see climate and disasters mixed together from their perspectives and their roles. Just a few minutes each, and then we'll start in with some questions that I'll direct your way. I'd love us to be able to wrap up by about 3:30 with organized stuff like this to open it up to questions from all of you, because I think many of you will have direct questions for this crowd. So you want to start down there? Clarke, you're sitting right here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Clarke Stevenson once again, and I've been tasked to repeating some of the acronyms that I had in my bio, so I'll probably stumble over those as well. But I'm the Forest Fire Resilience Watershed Research and Training Center. I'm representing the Cal Forest WRX Alliance in addition to some of the project work that I'm working on with the North Coast Resource Partnership under the Woody Feedstock, the OPR pilot program's Woody Feedstock Aggregation Project. And there's a number of components that I can speak to that. But I think there is a directed question about what are the challenges here that we face. Is that correct? Okay, so just pass it down. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Terre Logsdon, and I'm the Chief Climate Resiliency Officer and Tribal Liaison for the County of Lake, which is a brand new position. Well, It's 9 months old. It's about to be born. The County of Lake looked around at the issues that we've been having when it comes to climate-related disasters. As many of you in this room probably know, almost 70% of our county has burned in catastrophic wildfires since 2015. The Valley Fire kind of kicked off what they call in California the first, mega storm, the mega fires. At the beginning of it, it was burning 3,500 acres an hour. It was catastrophic. It was the first time that I served in an EOC, and I did that for a week. And it's really difficult to do that for your own community because you know people who are in harm's way. And so also Nicole mentioned in my bio, I was a tribal environmental director. And so when this position with the county came open, it was a difficult decision. I did not want to leave the job that I had and loved, but I wanted someone in this position that had tribal experience. And I wanted to do this position for Lake County because it was new. I'm a self-proclaimed chaos facilitator. That's what I do. My educational background leads me to systems thinking and looking for solutions and trying to be not the center of attention, but the center of a wheel, of the hub, the one who can pull it together and connect people. And so I'm really grateful that I can do this work for the county and the location that I love, and to serve that community. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks, Terry. I'm principally here because Terry thinks I can talk a lot, and she thought if I was here, she would have to talk less. We'll see if that's true. Shannon Kimball-Oth, for the 16 years prior to the 2015 Valley Fire, I think in Lake County, a lot of us measure before 2015 and after 2015. The 16 years prior to that, I served as a pastor of multi-denominational congregations and was principally known as Pastor Shannon who wants to get a homeless shelter in Lake County. And then in 2015, almost every person after that in Lake County learned what it meant to be displaced from their homes, and it became easier to do homeless ministry. But it also meant that I felt pulled to do a different kind of work in terms of disaster response. So coordinating the United Methodist Committee on Relief, UMCOR, and their partnership with FEMA after the Valley Fire led me to doing project restoration with the hospital and Hope Center with Hope Rising. And now I'm privileged to be working with the American Red Cross, which most people know as the largest provider of emergency shelter in the country, or maybe you come from a region that knows them for their blood donation work. But I'm really privileged to be part of a new program called the Community Adaptation Program, which is focused on how communities adapt to the increase of climate-caused disaster and how we can change those systems to be more resilient. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Mike Cottone, Trinity County Health and Human Services. I started with Health and Human Services in 1999, and I worked as a caseworker, a social worker in protective services, working primarily with older adults and adults with disabilities. Kind of worked my way up as a supervisor and then program manager, and was just kind of going along happily as a social worker, basically. When in 2017, during kind of in the midst of the Helena fire that impacted our community west of Weaverville, Junction City, the Board of Supervisors decided to move the Office of Emergency Services under Health and Human Services. So then myself and all of my colleagues suddenly became emergency managers, which was a totally new thing. But so the Office of Emergency Services coordinates county response to disasters. And that, before that, Health and Human Services has a mandate to basically conduct mass care and shelter operations, and we usually do that in partnership with American Red Cross. But it totally kind of changed my world and that of all the people that I work with there. But so for me, being here, I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm just happy to share kind of my experiences and probably at a very much kind of ground level on how the county responds to disasters, but also what we're doing to kind of identify the challenges that we're having around emergency communications and notification, things like emergency power. I know Senator McGuire alluded to some of the issues we have in our communities. We're very rural. We have no incorporated cities. We have lots of challenges with our outlying areas that often do not have access to telephone, whether landline or cellular, or they lose internet service. And so getting notifications out to them can be a real challenge. And then we're also doing some kind of interesting work around evacuation zones and evacuation routes. And so hopefully I can share some interesting information with you.
Nick Bound Crawford, as introduced, a proud native of Humboldt County. Born and raised, I left for some time, like most people do that grow up in Humboldt County. Landed in Atlanta, Georgia. I was working in hospitality and food systems. So I've been doing disaster management and relief work through World Central Kitchen. That was started about 20 years ago. When the pandemic happened, we saw a huge opportunity, massive food insecurity. There was, just in the hospitality industry, about 158,000 people in Atlanta that were laid off overnight. They were living paycheck to paycheck, and a large amount of them were undocumented who could not access any of the federal relief that was coming out. So we started a very grassroots feeding system that very quickly turned into quite the beast, and we ended up feeding around 3.8 million households in about 7.5 months. That program's still up and going. We entrusted it to the Latin America Association and the Women and Children's Shelter Network of the Southeast. And then when I moved back, joined Humboldt Made, which was economic development. Thought I would just kind of cool my jets and focus on that. And then the earthquake happened in December of 2022. And that really kind of just propelled me back into the disaster management sphere. Right before that, I had gotten involved with COAD, which is Community Organizations Active in Disaster. That's interchangeable with a VOAD, which is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. Different counties decide to call it different things. And at that point, what we had coined it was the baby COAD, and there's a couple people in this room that are responsible for getting me involved with that in the first place. Right now, I am chiefly coordinating the COAD. And so what we are a semblance of NGOs in the county. So just basically everything but government, those are our members. And then we have our partners that are in COAD, which are our government agencies. So COADs function through collaboration and in tandem with Office of Emergency Services. So we basically fill gaps. We move under the red tape. We don't have bureaucracy that holds us back. So we're able to collaborate and communicate on the ground level with the community and deploy resources at a very fast clip. So we were pushed into action after the earthquake in service of primarily Rio Dell, it was labeled the Ferndale earthquake, but the epicenter was very clearly in Rio Dell. Rio Dell overnight lost a massive percentage of its housing stock. They saw one of the highest recorded accelerations from any earthquake. It was over 1.6 G forces that hit Rio Dell. There were homes with holes in the ceiling where toilets had flown up into the ceiling off the ground in the bathroom. And we were faced with an entire community that was experiencing one of the highest levels of trauma that any of us had ever seen in our disaster management careers. That led me then into doing work in building the first long-term recovery group in Humboldt County around that incident. With the help of many other organizations that are in this room. Big shout out to the County of Humboldt and Humboldt Area Foundation for helping us seed and start that. We got that off the ground at what we were told was a very fast pace, up and running in comparison to other long-term recovery groups. And to this day, it is very active. We have disaster case management ongoing, and we have some large rebuild partners that are involved. One of the biggest challenges that we experience in disaster management in Humboldt County is just like the lack of available resources. Disaster management resources are really targeted towards larger population centers, rightly so, because there's more people there. But then that means that those resources are down in those population centers. So we have a warehouse of supplies that is down in Sacramento. And when major storms impact us, we lose, our two major highways that access our region. And so those resources just don't make it up to us. So that's left us with this really big, necessary community response to disaster, which is where COADs and VOADs really come into play. And that's what I do.
So I have a series of questions that I sent to these folks ahead of time, except for Shannon, sorry, or maybe you saw it after. That's lots of preparation. And I think it's probably, given what I've just heard, probably best just to kind of mix and mingle these according to your experience and your perspectives. Climate and climate change is usually dealt with as one of these sort of slow rolling kinds of processes that's been coming for a while, is coming now. But I think it's also clear that we're getting into a place where we're starting to hit thresholds, tipping points. We're starting to see, more extremes, both in terms of rainfall events, snow, et cetera. Then you've got tectonic processes operating that then unleash themselves on Rio Del with little mercy, right? And so you have very long-running processes intersecting very short-running processes. And you've got an entire set of machinery and academic thinking about longer processes like climate change or longer-running Earth processes. And then you've got shorter processes and shorter timescales like disaster relief, other kinds of relief operations. And so what are your challenges in managing the intersection of those in the communities you've worked in this region? We've got all of it here, right? We have climate change will and is impacting this region. Disasters have impacted this region for all time, really. How do you manage that? What are your advantages in terms of what sorts of things do we have going for us here, actually, that are beneficial, that we can actually innovate and show other communities how to respond better? And then obviously you've got at some of our disadvantages as well. I would just love to hear sort of open comments on any of that space for all of you. You just went, Nick. You want to go some more, or should we pass it on? Sure. Okay.
I'm definitely not a climate scientist or anything, but what the first responders and disaster managers were kind of seen as the folks that are on the front line of the impacts of the climate crisis. So we are really seeing the initial impacts of what's going on. And what our benefit in our region is, because we have these smaller groups and pockets of agencies and people, we have some pretty great personal relationships that we can rely on. So our two individuals that work for NOAA up in our area, I have their cell phone numbers in my phone. And so we can communicate on what I'm seeing on the ground. They can give us some preparedness notes on what to expect. So I think that's one of the advantages that we see. There's an awesome book that's out there called about being on the front lines of disaster and climate crisis, and it's called Disasterology. It's written by Samantha Montano, and it's a really fantastic book. So, yeah, she has a lot better things to say about it than I do.
Yeah, I guess I would say, kind of in our experience, the pace of disasters and what we're seeing in Trinity County has been pretty furious. I mean, and I think that, for wildfires, we have examples of the August complex where you have fires that just go on for weeks, and so your response becomes a little different. And I'm not talking, we don't do fire response. My folks aren't out there putting out fires, but we're in a position where we're trying to figure out how to help the community, but at the same time, they're still displaced from their homes, not able to return, and we have challenges around kind of our timelines for county to request assistance. In a disaster where it's exceeding your capacity as a local government to respond, you've got to look to the state and then possibly the federal government for help. And I think it's particularly for us, Helena, I think, was our first long-term recovery group that we stood up. And we've seen shifting from the Helena long-term recovery group to the August complex. And And again, big shout out to Humboldt Area Foundation as well, and NVCSS and a lot of the groups who helped us and sat and met with our long-term recovery group for months after the August complex on a weekly basis, trying to pull together. We don't have our COAD up yet, but we're working on that, just to try to figure out how to address that. But so when we have a disaster and we need to ask for help, we have to get out there and have staff do initial damage estimates, just so we can find out, are we going to qualify for assistance, and if so, how much? Are we going to be able to get individual assistance out to residents who lose their homes? But to do that, you have to be able to send a team out, and is it safe to do so, or is the fire still burning? So, but again, and like you said, Nick, I think the strength is, we're a small county. Everybody pretty much knows everybody, and so it's easy to call up, Jeff from the food bank and say, hey, Jeff, we got people down in southern part of the county who have no food. Can you get down there? And he'll do it just like that. Same thing with American Red Cross. I can get the disaster program manager on the phone immediately. I think, as we know, we can ask for help from the state and the feds, and hopefully it'll come, but it might be some time. We experienced that with, particularly kind of in the midst of the August complex, which 2020, right, we're also going through COVID. So we have like our staff who are trying to help do contact tracing and case management around COVID, and we're trying to provide disaster case management for our folks who are impacted by fire, because there's a disaster case management program out there that FEMA will fund, but it takes at least 6 months to get that on board. So it's really looking to your local folks. All disasters are local, so it doesn't matter who comes in to help you later. Right there at the beginning, you have to be the ones to handle it. And I think one of the big advantages we have, for better or worse, is that our citizens are used to disasters, and they're pretty darn resilient people, very strong. So thank you.
Thanks. I know how this survey would go if we were in Lake County. I don't know how it will go here equally, but I'm going to try it nonetheless. If since 2015 you have at least once been evacuated from your home, stand up. If, in addition to having been evacuated from your home at least once, you had to stay, you had no other choice but to stay in an emergency shelter, sit down. Sit down if you had no other choice. The numbers do not change that radically anywhere. Go ahead and have a seat. When the questions first came to me, the phrase that stood out to me was unfair advantage. That is the unfair advantage right there. People say that disaster is the great equalizer. It is not true. We're in the same disaster. We are not in the same boat. We experience displacement, but we don't all go to the shelter. So what is the unfair advantage? We can leverage empathy. We may not know individually what it is to be in the shelter at Rio Dell. I was there helping people at Rio Dell. I'm the facilitator of the COAD in Lake County, so I'm familiar with that work. But the unfair advantage is that we have some sense of what people are going through. And when I say what people, I mean that in 2021, 40% of all Americans across the country, 40% of Americans live in a county that experienced climate-driven disaster that led to displacement. So the unfair advantage is that we no longer are talking about something that is foreign. We're talking about something that we all have some tangible experience of and now have a different way to tell the story so that we can come together in a new way and to see it differently. So one other short illustration about how to see it differently, I can count on my hands the number of people in the audience that figured out that the flowers on the tables are meant for your name tags. They have stickies on the back of them, and you can attach it to your name tag so it's not quite so drab, to add a little bit of beauty to the moment. And for me, now some of you are checking this out to see if it's true. Layla's like, hey, will it fit on my forehead? So, but the thing, the thing about disaster work, I think, is that we can find beauty. And we can transform the experience that we've had into something else. In the Red Cross, there's a saying, when you've served on one disaster, you've served on one disaster. No two are exactly alike. And yet, the common experience is that it is all humans. We are all the humans and the beings that are experiencing the disaster, and we all have an equal opportunity to be the ones that make the difference. And in the Red Cross, one of the other pieces that we're sort of looking at is how we move that process of disaster response from being transactional to transformative. And when I say transactional, I mean like a disaster happens and the Red Cross opens a shelter, and then the disaster is decided to be over by somebody and the shelter closes and people leave. Instead, we want to take the opportunity to help find some beauty in this process. And so we now have a program called Shelter Resident Transition, where we're working one-on-one with people who are experiencing chronic health conditions and food instability and a lack of affordable housing in the wake of all of these disasters. And at the same time, as we're working with individuals who are displaced in the shelters, we are working with hyper-local partners, non-government partners, nonprofits, county agencies, to look at how we can, not how the Red Cross can do its mission better, but how we can help support those hyper-local partners who are really the ones that are going to bring resiliency to a community. So it's an exciting part of the work to be at, and I'm so pleased to see that more of you now have flowers on your name tags.
Beauty up the room. I've been thinking about how to respond to this, and to keep it succinct. And again, I go back to 2015, where we had the Rocky Fire and Jerusalem Fire and the Elk Fire and then the Valley Fire, where we had about 250,000 acres burned. Excuse me. And we had, even though we were in a drought, we had average rainfall that year. We weren't behind. The problem was, it all came in December in, I think, 2 atmospheric river storms, and then that was it. We had a lot of the flashy fuels grow, and we just had fire after fire after fire after devastation. And so when I took this position, one of the questions that I was asked in my interview was, how will you get community members on board who do not believe in climate change? And what I came down to, and what I still believe, and what I have said to people is, well, don't you want clean, safe drinking water? The money that is going to provide clean, safe drinking water is also going to, build the infrastructure to be more resilient against climate change. We've had to, all of the work that we've had to do. And don't you want better roads? We're going to have good evacuation plans. One of the grants that we are about to receive, we're in the final contracting phase, we're going to finally have a county-wide evacuation plan, which is massively huge. We're very excited about that work. And then thinking about what it is in Lake County that is, I think, can also be modeled in other counties. We have 7 federally recognized tribes. Our Board of Supervisors, 2 of the 5 elected officials are a tribal chairman and a former tribal chairman. We have an organization that I had the privilege and honor of helping to start, which is called the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance, which is training tribal members to work back on the land, to do landscape scale restoration. We in the Clear Lake Basin are honored to be living among people who have lived there since time immemorial, and I have seen in the past 8-10 years what I would consider a sea change of acknowledgement and understanding that traditional ecological knowledge is what is going to save us. It's going to save the environment, and it's going to save humans. And so incorporating that in the conversations that I have with our Resource Conservation District, with the Clear Lake Environmental Research Center, with Terra, with other organizations, is how do we bring that back? Because, you know, and even in our updated Community Wildfire Protection Program, we now have a whole section talking about the fact that 200 years ago, our tribes were forbidden from doing any work on the land. And this is why we're in the situation we're in. We need native stewardship. We need to do everything we can to support our tribes that are in our communities, because we're in their communities, so that they can steward the land and we can go on. And so I think we're, as a conversation, particularly in California, we're becoming more aware of that and making room for that and understanding that the dominant culture doesn't have all the answers. And I'm thrilled by this change. And as we look at the different funding opportunities right now, I don't know about any of you, it feels like I would say a fire hose. I guess it is a fire hose of grant money. You know, we're a very small county. If we get all the grants that I've written or have been part of, I'm going to need 3 of me just to do the work. So I'm very excited about that possibility because we have to do the work and do the planning. The state has some tools coming down finally for the North Coast. I don't know how many of you participate in the Wildfire Resilience Forest Health, Wildfire and Forest Health Resilience Task Force. We love those long acronyms. Does everyone know about this that goes on? Raise your hand if you have participated or know about it. The meeting that is for the North Coast, which we are a part of, is October 5th and 6th in Reading. I encourage you to either go or to Zoom in. There's major funding and conversations happening and tools that we're going to use for planning the projects on our land and how to protect it. So it seems to me like right now everything's coming together, and I'm thrilled to be part of it. Thank you.
That was awesome. Yeah, I'd like to echo everything that you just said as well. And I think that, you know, I always hate being first when I introduce myself because I realize that I said a lot of things without really explaining anything on why I'm being on this panel. You know, we have a lot of disaster management, coordination, and response here on the panel, and I am supposed to be representing the fuel reduction, preventative side, and economic opportunities because, you know, these disasters are happening. But that doesn't mean that fire is a bad thing, right? We know the science means that we're going to be having a lot more fires. We just need to have more preventative action to make sure that it's a good type of fire that we want, the mixed severity. We can't have high severity fires that leads to stand replacement, but we also need that low severity. We need that moderate severity, and that's not going to happen unless we really start managing our forests and our land. We need to take responsibility with that. So that's where this comes in and where I'm representing the Cal Forest WRX Alliance and, WRX, as well as the Feedstock Aggregation Pilot Project, because we now need to figure out, with all this forest restoration that's going to be happening, millions and millions of dollars from the state, from the feds, both on public and private land that needs to be managed, what are we going to do with all that wood? And that, you know, when we talk about challenges here, when you sent that question, I was stunned for, you know, about a good 12 hours because I was like, where to start? You know, there's so many barriers, so many things to talk about here. So I've developed my top 17. I do have 3, though, that are really important. When we talk about, you know, wood products markets, wood utilization, biomass utilization, the stuff that's coming off of our forest restoration and restoration projects in general, not just forest, but meadows and stream, habitat, all that stuff. Those are the primary goals and objectives that we have, right? We want to reduce wildfire risk for community protection. We want to increase carbon sequestration. And in some of those instances, we want to have better health and ecosystem services retained when we do these restoration projects. But those are our primary goals. Those are our motivations while we're in the forest and in the watershed. But it is, you know, the primary barrier to getting more of those projects done is because we don't have markets for this material. And this is where we get into the second, large challenge that we have, this chicken and egg situation where, foresters, loggers, practitioners of all sorts will say the reason why we don't have more projects coming off of, being tiered and nested is because we have low value for this material, high costs to operate, our terrain's complicated, and it's just a long process and burdensome. Essentially, we don't have a market, right? But then you talk to the market developers and they're saying like, well, we need a long-term feedstock supply. You need to incorporate this into your planning project so that we can actually take our business to the bank, get it funded, and get it developed. So we're speaking different languages here, and we need an intermediary entity to really facilitate that conversation. We need someone who is able to understand the land management priorities. We need someone to understand market development priorities, consumer demand priorities, and being able to negotiate how that should move forward with everyone's input, everyone's interests being represented and recognized. And this leads to my third, challenge, is that we don't have a silver bullet with wood products. We don't have a darling. We have a number of things that we've done in the past, and some of them are pretty controversial, like bioenergy. However, we need a mixed wood product solution in order to get ourselves out of the situation in this medium-term solution set. We have long-term solutions. We have advanced technology that we're working on that can really make a difference. But we are not there yet. So if we want to start talking about, preventative action with disasters the way that we know of them today because our forests are unhealthy in reference to wildfire specifically, we need to start looking at what are our economic opportunities, workforce development opportunities, and workforce opportunities both for the market developers but also for land management in order to get more of preventative action done. And we need these conversations to not only include the primary objectives while we're in the forest, but the secondary objectives, right? We need to understand that biomass utilization, the stuff that's coming off the forest restoration projects, are the largest issue to why we don't have additional projects being funded. We need the planning cycle to make sure that there's a market that's being developed. We need the market to ensure that the planning cycle has some place to put that material. And that is a very complicated situation, but it needs to happen. So I'm going to segue into talking about the opportunities here, where the North Coast Resource Partnership just finalized its awards for 4 separate pilot projects throughout the region, which extends from Sonoma all the way up to Siskiyou. And we love working with Lake. However, it is not a part of the NCRP. We have been working with some Tom Jordan out of Pomo Indians. Yep. And these projects, these pilots that are scattered throughout, one in Sonoma, one in Mendocino, and 2 in Humboldt, are going to be looking at how do we leverage the type of intellectual, workforce, economic hubs in order to start addressing opportunities for market development so we can target the preventative side of disaster. And post-fire restoration as well. That's also equally important. So we have 4 pilot projects that are going to start. We're going to start looking at the types of entities that could be formed that can start managing, negotiating, and even building that coalition around this conversation. What can we do in advance of a potential disaster scenario?
Have you had any luck on contracting biomass?
Contracting biomass is in
Getting a contract. I mean, that's always the issue.
getting a long-term feedstock contract. So this is fantastic. Thank you. So the Office of Planning and Research, OPR, they have this pilot project going throughout the state. I was lucky enough to be a part of the beginning of these conversations and the concept. And the pilot projects that we have going on throughout the North Coast is part of a larger 5 pilot project cohort going on throughout the state that's trying to look at long-term feedstock contract development, because that is the issue when you have a market developer that, is trying to develop. If you want to develop a market, you need to guarantee that you have supply to send to a lender. The lender will then finance you. And if you don't have that supply, then they're not going to finance you. So this project is trying to really overcome that hurdle. That is the main tenet, that is the language that we're using to try and get lenders, financial professionals, understanding that we have lowered the risk, lower the bar to entry for market opportunities and business development, so we can catalyze the entrepreneurs and the leaders that we've been talking about all today to start seeing this as a solution set, not as an issue. And we are learning as we're going, but there's definitely a lot that I could speak to on that. I'm a part of a couple of other pilot projects as well throughout the state, but it's hard.
Yeah, I guess we should get the other microphone at this end just to pass it around. Thank you for pivoting that conversation to, I mean, this is, after all, an economic development conference, right? And so I think there's a wonderful, I like the way you captured that there's obviously a threat, economic threat to fires, but there's also potentially an economic opportunity in helping address the challenge. From the rest of your collective experience, I'd love to hear what other kinds of sectors might be involved, not just forestry, logging, et cetera. What other kind of places have you seen opportunities like that emerge where we might actually drive economic growth and economic opportunity while also addressing and mitigating some of the risk and other climate and or disaster related trouble that you faced? I know from the community perspective. Sure. There you go.
Yeah, so a lot of my work historically has been in disaster food access management. So that's a really big kind of forte that I lean on, supporting the local food systems and the local restaurants, chefs, food trucks, and really involving them in the deployment of hot, fresh food out to the communities. One of my kind of partner organizations, North Coast Growers Association, is a very pivotal organization in Humboldt County in terms of advocating and supporting the local agriculture community. They also facilitate all the farmers markets. And this year they officially launched and moved into, and I have an office there too, our first food hub facility. So this is the spoke point where local ag will be aggregated out of. And this is also going to be a utilization measure in time of disaster as well. So the ultimate goal is that we rely on our local food systems and local agriculture to support these emergency feeding programs. And there's a couple other folks in this room that I'm working on a few other grants with that are focusing on building out these larger regional food system emergency feeding programs. So that we're really making sure that we're supporting the local economy at the same time while we're feeding people. During the storm cycle, that's what we did. I did on a kind of a smaller scale, did some fundraising for some grant funds, and then took that money out and just petitioned local food trucks and deployed them all over the county. Did that for about a month, and then for a 2-week period, we were operating feeding locations in about a 98-mile radius. And that hot meals program comes into play. It's a huge need, especially when all of your utilities get knocked out. We have an amazing food bank, Food for People in Humboldt County, but the distribution of boxes of raw produce and canned goods only goes so far if you can't cook it and you don't have safe potable water at home to prepare it in a sanitary measures. So that's really where you rely on these kind of local food producers. And so while we were feeding people, we were able to drive over $100,000 back into the local economy that is otherwise stalled at the point of disaster. So food is one of these big economic drivers that we can lean on to keep the economy rolling and keep the dollars as local as possible. And it's becoming a lot more accessible. We have, there's local food purchasing kind of like agreement funds that we have available that NCGA is working through that actually gives them the money to procure directly from these local ag groups, and then that can go straight to our community food banks or be accessible in times of disaster. So food is one of my favorite ways to kind of tie in economic development and economic protections during disaster and make sure that dollars remain local and that they keep circulating.
Yeah, well, sorry to say, I don't think I have a really good example from an economic development standpoint because of kind of where I'm seated in social services and OES. But I think there are potential. I know there is some work being done by some of our managers in employment services around workforce development and our local SMART Center to work on kind of workforce around fuels reduction and those kinds of projects. And I would like to see more of that being done. Actually, one of my first jobs before starting with the county many years ago was with a crew at the Watershed Center doing fuels reduction. And so I know there's a lot that still needs to be done. And to the extent that we have people who need a job, and from my perspective and that of our staff who do employment and training, the CalWorks program and that kind of thing, and helping people achieve self-sufficiency, I would just love to see more opportunities around that. Getting people who, particularly, we are one of the poorest counties in the state, so I'd love to see more opportunities around, let's kind of kill two birds with one stone. We need fuels reduction work done. We have people who need work. If we had more funding around developing that and getting more of that work done, I think that'd be beneficial.
One of the things that I think is an opportunity for economic development post-disaster is that we need to create new models for resiliency. And what I mean by that is fire adaptive housing. Certainly, as Senator McGuire was talking about this morning, home hardening and those sorts of things, which is all by itself a different career path that we could be training people for, but also rammed earth or 3D printed houses out of concrete. And the advantage of the 3D printed houses or the rammed earth or even straw bale construction, right? Because the straw, people think that the straw would burn quickly, but it doesn't because there's no oxygen between the layers. So these are three models of housing that are not happening on a large scale, I don't think, in any of our communities, but they could be. And there is a significant, somebody mentioned that there's a lot of grants, a fire hose of grants, and many of them are at the intersection of disaster, climate, and workforce development. So we could be looking, this is an opportunity for us to be looking at that. And I particularly think about this through the lens of housing, not only because of climate-caused displacement in terms of housing, but many of our communities are seeing an increase in the experience of homelessness overall. In 2020, in Lake County, we have I don't know if people are familiar with the pit count, but every year in January, there's a point in time survey of how many people are experiencing homelessness on any given night in that one location. And so at the and local communities can add their own questions. HUD tells you must ask these questions, but then the local communities can add their own questions. And in 2020, we interviewed on that one day, we interviewed 337 people experiencing homelessness in Lake County. 53% of them identified that their homelessness was caused by wildfire in Lake County. Of those 53%, 33% said that their homelessness was caused by the Mendocino Complex fire, which was 2 years before that survey. And 30% of them said that their homelessness was caused by the Valley Fire, which was 5 years prior to that survey. So as we look at economic development and job force development or workforce development, and new opportunities, one of the things that I think we need to be looking at is also how we increase our housing stock in a way that is fire adaptive.
I couldn't agree more. The County of Lake is hiring for a deputy administrative officer for housing. So just, if you're into housing or know anyone. Because as Shannon said, after the fires, that was the one thing that was extremely apparent in Lake County is there's not enough housing. We lost, I forget the percentage of,
1,280 just Valley Fire.
yeah, just in the one fire. But what also happened is renters were displaced because insurance companies would, could pay more. So so the numbers were never really tracked. There wasn't a way for that. So housing is something, and there's funding for that now. And I think we're going to be talking about housing later, so I won't go too much further on that. I like the idea of straw bale and cob and rammed earth and all of those, and we should be able to have it. They're very affordable, and it's a community building. Everybody can build their own home with that. That's what I love about that technology. But also when it comes to food, in 2017, well, let me back up a little bit. A long time ago, and there's a couple of us in this room remember when we had a food policy council in Lake County, and we do again, and it's new iteration, which is great because there's a realization after 2017 when the floods, if everyone remembers when everyone in Northern California around Chico was evacuated because the Oroville Dam might fail. Highway 20, which is the major corridor into Lake County, was closed. Grocery stores, in a matter of hours, were running out of food. Because they hadn't rerouted yet to come back around. But when the flooding happened and Highway 20 closed, it was extremely apparent very, very quickly that if there's a major earthquake or if Highway 20 or 29, because we only have two highways that come in and out, and 175, that come in and out of Lake County, two that trucks can go on, we're going to run out of food in the grocery stores. And so we're really glad that there's going to be another food policy council to look at that, to try again. But this time the focus of it is making sure that the restaurants and institutional purchasers are on board so that they're the ones who buy higher quantities. Previously we tried, it wasn't as successful. I'm hoping that it will be now. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I think I wanted to make a comment about the funding and how we just have so much. And I wanted to make a point that, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone remembers this, but in 2021, we had $1 billion allocation to a suite of different state agencies to address wildfire risk and fire resiliency. That's where the task force was born out of. That was that transition to that name. And then Governor Newsom was like, I want to give you another $1 billion, $2 billion essentially to CAL FIRE. And CAL FIRE was like, we can't do that. We don't have the workforce. We can't put that money on the ground. It's not possible. And I think that is really salient with me these days because we have these forest restoration goals to increase the pace and scale of restoration throughout the state, and yet we don't have the workforce capacity to actually accomplish that. So when we're talking about all these things, economic opportunity, it's going to have a larger reliance on subsidies in this interim as we move into the future, and especially when we're talking about market development, that's going to have to be really well supported by these types of public interests and strategies. And I wanted to shift also to the housing comment because one of our projects, the pilot projects in Mendocino, they are trying to look at these, forgotten sizes of trees that are also problematic. Biomass is traditionally textbook known as under 10 inches DBH, and you have merchantable timber that can turn into lumber for home development and construction above 20 DBH. By the way, is anyone here a forester before I talk myself into a hole? Great. 20 inches DBH is usually the construction size that they go for, above that. And then there's this forgotten size, 10 inch to 18 inches generally, that is, still problematic within our forests because those are the ladder fuels to a certain extent. So we have one of the projects in this pilot program looking at ways to build the straw houses, looking at way to build alternative home models with pole construction. Is anyone familiar with the Pole Craft solution? I think they're a company in Mendocino. Yeah, they're a little bit of celebrities, in my opinion. So I think they're embarking on this idea of using that forgotten size of poles in order to build these kits, these fire risk reduction material to help create that housing stock that we're missing, and having that housing stock be a bit more resilient to some of the disastrous climate impacts that we're going to experience. So why can't we do that elsewhere? And I think that's, yeah, I'll pass it down.
You want to add one?
Yeah, I think, everybody super clearly understands the importance of disaster preparedness and its relation to kind of economic impacts. On the flip side, though, it's a lot of recovery. Our recovery processes need to be more resilient and efficient. And what a lot of people don't understand about the recovery processes is that unless you have a federal designation, which puts you under the FEMA wing, government does not participate in recovery processes. And so for rural counties, that's really a huge challenge to meet that unless you have a very catastrophic event. So Rio Del, we use that as an example a lot. While the impact was massive to the community in Rio Del because of their economic state and their home values, they did not meet that FEMA dollar amount threshold. And so it's left up to a total community-led recovery process. So recovery processes need to be better funded. They need to be more efficient and resilient. And we really have to get better at the recovery aspect of it because, we'll prepare as much as we can, but we know that these events are going to be inevitable. And so while we focus on being as prepared as possible, we also need to be focused on how we recover faster and better every time. Because the longer your recovery process goes, the larger the impact is to your economic development. And we have folks that just have chosen not to return to Rio Del, and that's a hit to our labor force and the overall economy in a very small little town. So those just a few people leaving leaves a huge scar on the town. So that's what we're really focusing on right now is how we make these recovery processes more better and resilient going forward.
Excellent. One more question for me, and then I'd like to open it up to questions from the crew. So get them ready. Related to that, who and picking up the theme from earlier, who is not in the room? What other resources do you need? Sounds like there's tons of money coming, but it's all different flavors and from different places, and so it sounds like there might obviously be some staffing challenges on your side. What can the university sectors, school sectors bring? What other agencies should be involved in this discussion to help you do your jobs better, and then to help us all help you?
I think this is a great topic, and while we're talking about housing and long-term recovery, which these are things obviously that we all deal with, and FEMA funding, we had the Helena fire, we lost 72 homes, and I don't know if you know the kind of finer points of FEMA disaster assistance, but there's individual assistance, which is assistance to individuals and households, and there's public assistance, which is assistance to kind of public infrastructure like your roads and your facilities and response costs and that kind of thing. And like Nick said, to meet that threshold is pretty hard. FEMA says, there is kind of a threshold for public assistance side, but they say they don't really have one for the IHP or the individual and households program, but there's a calculation. But, we have had multiple disasters. We had in 2020 and 2021 where we did qualify for kind of more broad individual assistance. But like Nick said, it doesn't meet the need, particularly where people are trying to rebuild homes. We still have people trying to rebuild from the August complex in 2020. And I see kind of the same thing in housing, and that is the restrictions that are tied to funding. Even in our low county, Trinity County, we have a used housing issue with housing stock. not even withstanding the houses that we've lost in multiple years of wildfires, but trying to build housing. We just actually, HHS, our department is really good at taking over programs in the county, and we seem to be the one that the county administration says, oh, we're having a problem with this department because it's the only person that was in that department left, and so we're going to give it to HHS. So we're in the midst of incorporating our housing division into our department, and we're trying to make sense of what has happened so far and how we're going to incorporate that into our Department of Social Services funded housing programs, of which there are many. And so we have all these separate and disparate sources of funding for housing, but there are so many restrictions on what we can do with it that we can't really get anything done. One of the projects that housing division had been working on for like 5 years was to build some multi-unit dwellings, apartments that would serve low-income people, people with disabilities, veterans. There was a bunch of different funding sources that had those restrictions, and they were trying to pull together all that stuff. But it turns out that, number one, you have to build it within so many miles of services. Well, it's a rural county. There's only services in a couple of towns, right? When you look at what's available within that area that you're limited to, there are things like mine tailings that you have to clear out in order to be able to build, but the housing funding doesn't allow you to do that with that money. And so your hands are tied, and it just feels like, particularly with housing, there's so much money that gets thrown out there, but you're so limited on how you can do it. And so what I like is, and this was kind of the thing years ago, back in 1991 and then in 2011, in the social services world, we had this thing called realignment, where the state said, well, we're going to take all this funding that's in these little pockets, and we're just going to throw it in this big pot. There's actually a few little pots, but we'll throw it in this big pot, and then you can decide how to do it. Now, the other side of that was that, well, we're going to give responsibility for administering these programs from the state to the counties. But it also gave you a little more discretion on how to run your programs. And so, and I don't know what the exact answer is as to who needs to be in the room, but I think, at least the state level, we need, legislators, Department of Finance, the governor's office in the room to listen to concerns from counties about how funding is restricted. We're throwing so much money at homelessness and housing, but are we solving the problem? Not if you watch the news. So I think just giving counties more discretion on how to use that funding and solve their own problems.
Thank you. Yes, to all of that. And when we're looking at who's not in the room, what my experience is that it's not only who needs to be in the room that's not in the room, but what are the partnerships that are innovative that allows for these things? Thinking about the braiding of different funding streams as an example. Today, Senator McGuire was talking about Humboldt Polytech. It was Humboldt before. Okay, so sorry. Adding the nursing school and increasing the capacity for the health workforce, right? So schools and universities are often one of the missing partners in the room. We're talking about innovative housing solutions, but the projects that are doing well right now, particularly in terms of 3D printing, have a university partner, right? So University of Maine is doing a 3D printing with biomass and recycled plastics. Right now, the University of Texas is doing a 3D, not concrete, the other one. No. Anyway, it's a University of Texas partnership, and it's not only the builder, right? It's the curriculum that is training up the workforce, because schools have one source of funding, and then affordable housing is another source of funding. In Reading, the first 3D printed house that was built in the city of Reading was a partnership between BLM and affordable housing. And the way that they funded it was that they built the 3D house in a park and then said that they would limit that house to a family under a certain income who they would hire to serve as the host for that park. So they housed a family that had been experiencing homelessness. They built a new house and they braided funding from BLM and HUD, which who would have thought that that is the way to go? But I think that is the piece where we're sort of missing the mark. And for the Red Cross's community adaptation program, one of the things I wanted to come back to what you said earlier was that it's not only about preparedness. We all get that, like move on already. It's about how we can be more resilient afterwards, which means that we need to be able to build back faster. You're talking about building back from a fire in 2020. I'm talking about building back from a fire in 2015, right? We need to increase the capacity of our communities to build back faster. And the way to do that is to have education, finance, and social services. Those three have to be present all the way around. So our community action agencies, our universities and colleges, as well as those government development grants.
I'm trying to think of what to add. Because Lake County doesn't have a 4-year university. We have 2 community colleges, and they're wonderful, but they're not a 4-year university.
And they're based in other communities.
Yes.
We're satellites.
Yes, we are satellites to both of those, Woodland and Mendocino community colleges. I think what I see missing in the room are federal partners, tribal leadership, youth. I don't know how to make this type of event exciting enough to get people here, but we need, a big part of my work is partnerships, partnership forming, partnership, I think of the work that I do for the county as mise en place. So if anyone has ever worked in a kitchen, I'm the person who's going to put everything together so that other people can run and shine. I want to be in the background. I want to make sure that you have whatever you need to do the best that you can do. So I guess restaurants are missing. No, I can't.
This is a great question, and I think it's difficult because, once again, we're a secondary objective. Primary objectives are what I mentioned at the beginning, and those, intelligent minds and community willpower to address those primary objectives are where all the effort's going. And then when we get to the biomass and forest restoration conversation, there's burnout because we've tried things and they've failed. And then we recognize that it's not possible. So there's little interest to, do it again. But we need, echoing what has been said here, a new cohort of entrepreneurs, youth, leaders, but more primarily, like finding ways where we can connect and partner with tribes. And that is something that WRX Alliance is really spending time, dedicated time to doing, building that relational approach so that we can, go fast by going slow, or how, that one? Yeah, great. I'm looking at Jen because she's our facilitator. And making sure that everyone's included and involved on the design process before we start committing to projects. So that is something that we would love to continue more. And I actually really appreciate that I'm speaking in an economic summit because this is an economic development opportunity and market development opportunity, but we do see difficulties in trying to maintain consistency and capacity for economic development aligned agencies to continue to participate and be these guards, these bastions of communicating, please come to our county, please invest in our county through these opportunities, because we're building these pilot projects that can help reduce the barriers, but we need people to see that we're doing that work so that they can feel excited to come and participate in the solution.
Yeah, I think pretty good about getting whoever I need in the room, but I think who we're always searching for are those marginalized, minority, and underrepresented community members, because these are ultimately the people that we're serving the most. Disaster tends to act as a magnifying glass and an amplifier to what people are going through prior to going into a disaster. So if you're entering a disaster from a very disadvantaged space, economically, socially, that's just going to get amplified even more post-disaster. So we really need those voices in the room more than anything. And I think aside from that, I always need a bigger, more collaborative room. Kind of the biggest kind of ongoing project of working on the community organizing side on disaster management is the relationship between our efforts and government's efforts. And so that has to be a completely constant, nurtured relationship. And it's a very delicate relationship at times, but it can be really fruitful and effective in time of need.
Okay, Layla has a microphone, which is